Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce you to Yann Le Cam. Yann, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Steve.
Nice to see you. Yann, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind telling our audience about your background, how you ended up where you are today, please.
Thank you. In fact, my initial motivation really came in when I was a teenager because my father started to develop a cancer, then a second one, a third one, and ended up dying when I was 17 years old by the end of high school. And this is when I decided not to go to medicine, but rather to go to business school, because medicine for me was the place of failure. And my experience with hospital had been a disaster at the time. So that's why I went in that direction, and I went to business school with two ideas, really. I knew very well what my values were at that time, and I wanted either to make the world a better place by helping people in need, particularly through humanitarian action, or by making the world a more beautiful place by supporting production of arts. And that's how I ended up at the end of my management school to approach cancer research organization and to decide to work in one of them because there was an opportunity to become the deputy director general of that. And that's why I got involved in cancer research. And I thought I will do that just for a few years and then go back to more regular work. And I never did, because then I started to work with the US, and I went to work in the US, develop a foundation for 5 years there, dedicated to the coordination of cancer research program between the US and Europe. Then my first friends were starting to die of HIV in New York, where I was living with my wife. And that's how I decided to come back to France and become the director general of the major volunteer-based AIDS organization called AID, with 3,000 volunteers and 100 chapters across France. And that has been a tough but fantastic adventure of 8-9 years during the epidemic through 92 through 99, basically 91, 99. And in the course of that action, my first daughter was born with cystic fibrosis. And that's how I discovered another world, the world of the forgotten. And we went with my daughter to the US to see the best experts, but also to Denmark or in France. And I realized how important international approach was, how the differences were in terms of care from one country to another between Canada, US, Denmark, UK, and France, for instance, on cystic fibrosis. And as that's how really I came involved. So it was life. It's my father, it's France, it's my daughter. And this is so after that, I continued to be involved with the genetic diseases because I worked for FM Téléthon for a few years. Then I created the French Alliance for Rare Disease in France. And that's how also in the meantime, we created EURORDIS and the International Alliance of Patients Organization in London. So that's part of my actions in that time.
EURORDIS was commenced in 1997, is that correct?
Correct. In fact, the idea really came up in 93. And my experience when I was in the US, the consultant I was working with for public affairs in Washington, working with the Congress and National Institute of Health, was also working for Abby Myers and NORD, the National Organization for Rare Disease in the US. So that's how I discovered what orphan drugs really meant and what it was in the late 80s, early 90s. So when I came back in France and seeing my daughter affected by cystic fibrosis, I went to AFM in 91 and said, what about creating an international organization for genetic disease, for rare genetic disease or rare diseases, something like that? And what about having an orphan legislation, which was not completely a new idea because there had been attempts in the UK to develop one, which failed. And that's how, through that, in 93 and discussions with friends, one of my friends, in fact, initiated with Simone Veil, Minister of Health and Social Affairs in France at the time, initiated under the French EU presidency the idea of a legislation on orphan medicinal products at the European level. So basically to create a European law in order to attract investment in an area which lacks interest or where there is no sufficient return on investment for a company without a specific financial incentive. And that was the concept in the US, which we transposed to the European environment. And we created EURORDIS initially to be the advocate of that future legislation. But the difference with the US is that from the beginning in Europe, we had that vision that we wanted to create a movement which is more public health at large and information and healthcare, and not only focused on the development of medicines.
As the CEO of EURORDIS, tell me about the size of the organization today.
So today, the organization has more than 1,000, I think it's 1,050 members across Europe. EURORDIS covers 48 countries in Europe. Important are the national alliances. We have national alliances in over 35 countries now. So gathering the patient groups at the national level. There is more than 70 European federation or international federation for one disease or a group of diseases. So these two network of national alliances and European federations are absolutely essentials. So EURORDIS today, it's this 1,000 membership. It's around 300 volunteers. It's 60 staff person. It's a budget of 7.5 million per year that comes in a pretty balanced way. 1/3 from its own membership and FM Téléthon, 1/3 from the European Commission through operating grant and different projects, and 1/3 from the industry and the foundations. And for industry, it's spread over 72 companies that we have a one-to-one dialogue with.
How have policies evolved since 1997 inside of EURORDIS, and how have they impacted on rare diseases?
Honestly, that's one of the things I'm probably the most proud of. When you ask about the size, the thing I will tell you that the most proud of is certainly the volunteers, because having volunteers across Europe is really not an easy thing. And a lot of people are saying that we will fail. And we're very fortunate because we have this diversity of volunteers gives a diversity of rare disease, a diversity of culture and countries and languages. But we have one ethos, we have one strategy, one common set of values, and one common way of working. So this is what makes us strong. And in terms of achievements, in terms of policy, to your question, we can be really proud of that because it's more than 8 legislations that have been passed or supported or encouraged by that organization, for which we have been frontline advocates, I would say. So first and foremost, obviously, the European legislation on orphan medicinal products, adopted in 1999, implemented 2000. Then 2006, it's the European legislation on pediatric use of medicines. The following year, it's the European legislation on the advanced medicinal products. So that's the gene, cell therapy, tissue engineering. Then later in 2008, 2009, it's the European Commission communication on rare disease. So making rare disease a priority across the European Commission, particularly in the research program and the public health program. And then the following year, the Council recommendation on rare diseases, which is national strategies or national plans on rare diseases, which is the case now. All 27 member states, and before that with the UK 28, have national strategies or national plans on rare diseases with specific objectives. And that was essential because, just to give one example so that you understand where we're going, is that one of the key elements in that strategy was to identify the centers of expertise and to start that networking at national level. And then we passed another legislation, we advocated, let's say, and for another legislation in which is the directive on cross-border healthcare, and into also the call for coordination of HTA at the European level. So the European reference networks, the legislation, the directive was passed in 2011, implementation started from 2014, and in 2017, after call for proposals, etc., all together as a community, so the medical experts, the patients, the European Commission, the member states, to launch 24 European reference networks for rare diseases. So now we have European network for rare pulmonary diseases, for rare kidney disease, for rare bone disease, or for hematological cancer, for instance, etc. So 24 areas, or rare metabolic diseases. And today, after a second cycle of inclusion of centers, there is 1,500 university hospital centers of care, multidisciplinary centers with different competences of doctors specialized in rare diseases. So that is a critical mass, and that quantity is a change of quality of care at the European level. It's pioneering. That's the first time that the European Union starts something at the European level on the organization of care. It's not only in the remit of the member states. No, there is a coordination here where we bring experts together, where we produce clinical trials, good practice of diagnostic and care, where we produce structure for some of the clinical research, where we also develop registries, so trainings of experts. So that's huge. And more recently, there was the legislation on HTA, which was just passed more than a year ago. And now at the European level, health technology assessment will be done at the European level, first for cancer and for gene and cell therapies from 2025, and from 2028 for all orphan medicinal products. So we'll have a more aligned, hopefully, and more seamless process between what's happening at the European Medicine Agency and HTA at the European level.
Okay, so how long does somebody with a rare disease have to wait for diagnosis?
So it depends which source you look at, but the accepted number is to say 4 years on average. So we have to be careful when we say that, though, because that's what the publications show and the surveys show. But there's also a lot of BI in these surveys, because somehow you get more answers from the one who have difficulties to access diagnose, right? So when you compare to 10 years, 20 years ago, but it's still a long time. So for some diseases where there is newborn screening, or where there is good methodologies to identify the disease, it is reduced. It is a reduced time. It goes faster. For other diseases, it takes very long time, like 20 years. And sometimes it is because it's a very difficult disease to diagnose because of the nature of the syndrome itself. But there is also a consensus in that community between the experts, the clinical experts, but also the scientists, the geneticists, and the patients' organizations, that we could reduce the time to diagnostic to 6 months after the first contact with a healthcare professional. And this is the objective that we have for 2030. And that's a paradigm change, really. It means, in particular, to organize the healthcare, to organize healthcare pathways at national level and connected at the European level, so that there is a quicker referrals of patients and a discussion on the most complex cases. Second, it's the training of healthcare professionals at large, and particularly to develop the culture of the doubts, not to keep the patients, but when you have doubts about what it could it be a rare disease, then to refer the patients and to engage with other healthcare professionals with maybe the most adequate expertise. It's also the development of newborn screening, which is essential. It is crazy to continue to have newborn screening only on 2 diseases, like in Romania, for instance, when you have over 40 rare diseases screened now in Italy or in Netherlands. But what we want is much more. It has to be hundreds, in fact, of diseases to be screened for the newborns, in order to go much faster. And also the use of some of the new technologies, like whole genome sequencing, so the new approaches to diagnostic in order to speed up.
I'm very proud of the work that's been done in the Netherlands and in Italy on the screening. Can you tell the audience something about those processes? I know you had an involvement in that.
Yes, what we're trying to do really is that it's fantastic that some countries, we often critical about how Europe functions, but I think it's important the member states have that freedom to go faster than others, because somehow it's better than always trying to find the lowest common denominator, right? So it's good to have Italy and Netherlands leading on that. But there is more countries who want to open up to more newborn screening. Slovenia, for instance, or others. And so what we have done is, in fact, to build on the momentum of Italy and Netherlands, to learn from their experience that it's not easy to scale up. It's not easy to screen more diseases because you need to adapt your infrastructure, your labs, your there is processes. So it's complex. There is different aspects which are more into the execution in the implementation phase. And we brought these discussions within the EU presidency of Slovenia, of the Czech Republic also, after that last year, where there were some technical meetings. And now we pushed a recommendation to the European Commission to have a joint action between the volunteering member states. We're not saying the 27, but the one who are willing to go faster and to learn from the leaders in order to work together on scaling up newborn screening in Europe. At the same time, we're encouraging the Joint Research Center of the European Commission to take responsibility on that, exactly as they have done on cancer. They have done it, as you know, for breast cancer, and after that for prostate and lung cancer, etc. So they are ready to do it for rare diseases, but for that they need a clear mandate from the DG Santé and the funding from DG Santé to do it, and also I would say some encouragement from the member states. So that goes together with the joint action. So I'm hopeful that this will be in the pipeline in 24, 25 at the latest, in terms of joint action, and also to engage a joint research center. So with that, I can become hopeful that we are on track by 27, let's say.
I think that work is absolutely outstanding. I've been a fan of that for some time. How do you bring highly specialized clinicians and scientists together across borders?
So it depends. If you're talking about care, it's really what I was referring to before. So the European Reference Network for Rare Diseases. So that's really about care. And I know it's a bit subtle sometimes to get, because the selection of the university hospital multidisciplinary center for a group of diseases is based on certain criteria, which includes their research, scientific publications, and their capacity to do research, and not only to provide care. But the European Reference Networks are fully about healthcare. It's healthcare. So it's about networking these experts together, getting to know each other, getting to work together through new digital instruments like virtual clinical boards to discuss with the diagnostic or specific complex issues around one patient and across borders. It's the development of common good practice on diagnostic and care and treatments of patients. It is the training of experts or the exchanges of experts within the network. It's the collection and use of data in the network, so around registries, but it's also natural history study. It's around research on care, if not on new medicines or things like that. So that's how they connect really increasingly. And I hope also that with that strategy, we make this area of medicine more attractive, that we will be able to attract more talented young doctors, because there is a career which is possible in rare disease across several rare diseases and across Europe. So that there is excellence in care in that area, there is innovation, and there is the potential to extend the duration and the quality or duration of life and quality of life of patients. So we hope that this also will attract talented doctors. Now, when it comes to research, it's a bit different here. I would say it's less structured, it's more open, because it can be on scientific research, or it can be on clinical research, like clinical trials or other type of clinical work. And here, what we're doing is to push now for the structuration at the European level of clinical research networks for rare diseases. And that's inspired both by your experience of the European Reference Network for Care, but also inspired by the experience in the USA, where the National Institute of Health, NIH, has created more than 10 years ago, 15 years ago, it started to organize clinical research network for rare diseases. And they have about 25 of them covering over 300 different rare diseases. And their commonality is their first responsibility is to have a registry for that disease with common data elements and quality data following the same procedures, to have natural history studies, and to do research on clinical endpoints or surrogate endpoints. So we're pushing the transposition of that model in Europe, to which we have only added to work on patients-reported outcome measures, in addition to the clinical endpoints and surrogate endpoints. And this will start really from next year, the shaping of that, in the context of something called the Rare Disease Partnership, which is a financial instrument of Horizon Europe, which will start from 2024 for 6 years, to strengthen the collaboration between the member states with the European Commission, and to fund different activities that exist today, like common call for proposals across Europe, coordination of research policies between member states, but now also to have these clinical research networks, which will obviously be articulated with the European Reference Network for Rare Disease on care, if you follow me. So it's slow, it's building blocks, I would say, but progressively we're coming to a place where I hope that Europe will be well prepared to become an attractive place for clinical trials on rare diseases, because you will be able in few days to identify how many patients there are with a certain genotype, phenotype, be able to identify where they are, and potentially to start recruiting them for a clinical trial. So that's a total change compared to the situation where we are today.
That's fantastic news. Thank you. Tell me, what are the barriers to people who are experiencing a rare disease to receiving effective treatment?
Honestly, what we see is that today in Europe, I'm talking about Europe, not in the world. In Europe, the first barrier is probably in the family. Is that we've done recently, in the last 12 months, a big survey on access to diagnosis. And we can derive from that certain number of conclusions and try to decipher what's behind that. And what we observe is that, in fact, for children, after 3 years and until they are teenagers, there is a too long delay of access to diagnostics, because probably we don't listen enough to our own child, or in the family we don't want to see the problem, or so all that kind of thing. We also see that there is a longer delay of access to diagnostic for young girls or for women than for young boys or men. So that's not only the medical community, that's also the mental representation in the families, right? That obviously all little girls are always complaining even when they have nothing, when the boys are strong, and the same for the women and the men. So it's mental societal representations which are also a barrier to access to diagnostics. So that's the first one. The second is that culture from the healthcare professionals, and particularly from the general practitioners or the pediatricians, or some of the specialist doctors in the community, to not to keep the patients for themselves and try to find by themselves the diagnostic, absolutely, but to immediately think, okay, could that be a rare disease? And then to refer. So some of the things we're doing, for instance, is to work with experts or network of experts like Orphanet, for instance, or companies, if I may mention a name, like Sanofi, with working on a pilot to develop a tool for general practitioners, from what they enter on their computer about that patient, then to have pop-up to say, oh, have you thought about asking that question or that question, just to help, you see, go faster in the diagnostic tree for the patients. And so we're doing that, and we're doing other stuff with Takeda and with in the context of the Global Commission on the ending the diagnostic odyssey for children with rare disease. Also in the context of EU projects co-funded by pharma, like Screen for Care, which is co-led by EURORDIS, Pfizer, and academic team in Italy. So there is different tools being developed which make us more optimistic about addressing some of these barriers. But the barriers today in Europe, it's not the absence of expertise in hospital, it's not the absence of coverage. The barriers are elsewhere. So completely different than if I look at some countries in Africa or Latin America or in Asia, for instance.
I'd never considered that there is a targeted psychological support system that needs to be in place for a rare disease, yes?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, tell me, I think that I've been immensely impressed with the achievements over the last 10 years, or so it's actually since its commencement. You're obviously using data to everyone's advantage. Can you tell me something about that story?
In the field of rare disease, the big issue is lack of recognition, but also lack of knowledge. Lack of knowledge scientifically, because for most of the rare diseases, there is very few publications. And we see a direct link between the number of publications and the progress toward treatment options. So I can mention from memory work we did some years ago. It's a bit outdated, but I think the principles are still valid. It was about 10 years ago. We did a work with Orphanet to look at what were the threshold, and more than 6 for one rare disease, when there is more than 600 scientific publications, then there is several clinical trials ongoing and potentially some product approved. Between 200 and 600, you may have clinical trials and some activities. Below 200 scientific publications, there is almost nothing happening. And that covers only, let's say, 20% of the rare diseases today. So there is a huge gap in terms of knowledge. The second is in the care. The issue with rare disease is the fragmentation of expertise, fragmentation of data. So it's not that we know nothing, but these data collected by each experts on their patients were not aggregated in order to try to derive any lessons. So that is what is changing, which has changed already in the last 15 years, but which is changing increasingly faster, thanks to the new technologies, obviously, but also thanks to the adoption of common data elements. So there is a set of common data elements which have been approved between the European Reference Networks, within the International Consortium of Research for Rare Diseases, within the European Joint Program, COFUND, etc. So different places, so that progressively it becomes the consensus of the clinical community, of the scientific community, of the member states, to use this common data set, which are really the building block for registries on rare diseases, and then to be able to have quality collection of data and then gathering and analysis of this data. And that's really the issue, is the quality of the data. It's not only about collecting data, particularly in the field of rare diseases. So, and what is changing now is because of the new European legislations on data protection, and particularly the future legislation on health data, but also because of the new technologies, we can go in the direction now of almost big data for rare diseases. What I mean by that is that there is hope now that we would be able, for most of the rare diseases, to have registries to collect this data and to derive information in terms of best practice of diagnostic, best practice of treatment, best practice of care, and potentially also to do additional research. So the use, to say it with the technical jargon, is to say that the use and reuse of data for healthcare purpose or for research purpose will be much easier. And this is what the patients are calling for. 99% of us, through surveys, we say we want to use and reuse of our data for healthcare and research purpose, but we want it to be protected from misuse, like for insurance or for employers. But big data goes beyond, is what we can derive from the analysis of data across rare disease and across Europe, maybe across the world. So, and with that, we will certainly get into new knowledge, particularly around the etiology of rare diseases, to better understand some of the triggers. Today, there is a huge focus on the genetics. Certain number of us are convinced that there is much more there. We know so little about the genetic today and about the epigenetic, right? So all the element of environment factor, food factor, etc., which can play a role in triggering some of these epigenetic or genetic factors, we will get to know more and more progressively.
That's fantastic. Thank you. So is there anything else you'd like to discuss or bring to our people's attention?
Certainly, for me, it's the one of the major issue today and in front of us growingly is the access to treatment, and particularly that science and technology and investment are now bringing us potentially curative treatment or transformative treatments, which enables patients affected or babies affected to have an almost normal life expectancy. So it's a change. 10 or 20 years ago, people will not think of rare disease as with an objective of curing the disease, right? As it is for cancer, for instance, which has been an objective since the 80s, really, to say curing cancer. That has never been a slogan for rare diseases. And I think we're far from that with the research existing. It will only be some rare disease among the 6,000 rare diseases. But still, it's there. There is now that potential to cure or to have an almost normal life with a chronic recurrent treatment. But the issue here is it's complex technologies, very small population, and perceived high price. And often it is a very high price, an outraging price for someone, a citizen in the street. So we need to provide access, because it cannot be that we have the capacity of investment and the science and the technology to deliver that hope, to deliver that progress to humanity, and not to provide it simply because we are not able as a society to organize ourselves to deliver. And just thinking quality and thinking what I can afford compared to diabetes and Alzheimer is just not a way to think. If we are serious about leaving no one behind, we need to be more creative than that. We need to accept that also science and technology evolves, and that the cost of this technology also evolve and will be reduced over time when new technologies will come in. So we need to think differently. And what we are calling for as a patient movement is to say, hey, member states, come together to use your power, your bargaining power at the European level, to be a responsible and a good partner of the companies to negotiate your price and your access and your generation of additional data. And this is the way forward. And the companies are not against it. It's just about the how we do it. But then for the companies to have aftermarket utilization, an immediate HTA evaluation, an immediate access to the patients corresponding to the profile of the product, a better collection of data on these patients with these treatments in order to reduce the uncertainties and be able to reassess the real value, the clinical value of that product and how it translates into meaningful benefit for patients. And then what's the value for money of that treatment, right, at the European level, in exchange for the company of a guarantee of market for the next 3 or 4 years with a negotiated package. In exchange of that, the companies are ready to give up a lot on their price. And even if we are not naive about the tensions between the different type of markets like US and Europe and Japan and all that, still there is something. So we can turn in Europe. Europe is often criticized for being bureaucratic and centralized and very public management type of, right, for healthcare, for decision-making, insurance, all that. But here it can be an asset. We can turn that inconvenience in an asset, because if we come together, we're able to be responsible negotiator and data collector to make well-informed decisions and be good partner to attract more investment in Europe, particularly if at the same time we organize the clinical trial research environment as I described before. This is really our goal, to make Europe a better place to attract investment, to do clinical trial, to bring innovation to patients and improve more faster the survival and the quality of life of patients in Europe compared to the rest of the world.
I love your passion and your intelligence. It's fabulous. I've really enjoyed talking to you today, and I'm very honored to have talked to you. And I know that you've achieved, well, you and your team have achieved some remarkable things across Europe, and it continues. So I wanted to wish you all the very best. And I look forward to talking to you again in 6 months' time.
Thank you, Steve, for this opportunity.